Hello and welcome. I'm Leigh-Ann Gerrans and you're watching W News Extra, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya studios. These are our top stories. President Trump warns another armada is floating towards Iran as he says time is running out for Tehran. Meanwhile, the US president says things will de-escalate in Minnesota following the fatal shootings of 2 US citizens by ICE agents. And Syria's leader arrives in Moscow to discuss bilateral ties and the situation in the Middle East with Vladimir Putin. Another US armada is said to be floating towards Iran as President Trump hopes Tehran will make a deal with Washington. Trump had previously threatened military intervention in Iran following the crackdown on protests and an internet blackout. Now, the USS Abraham Lincoln has arrived in the Middle East waters, although its precise location does remain top secret. Here's what the US president told crowds at a rally in Iowa.
In June, we obliterated Iran's nuclear capacity in Operation Midnight Hammer. You saw that. People have been waiting for 22 years to do that, and we were right at the end. They were about a month away from having a nuclear weapon. We had to do it. And by the way, there's another beautiful armada floating beautifully toward Iran right now. So we'll see. I hope they make a deal. I hope they make a deal. They should have made a deal the first time.
To discuss this and all of today's stories, I'm joined by Freddy Gray, Deputy Editor of The Spectator, who joins us from London, and broadcaster and journalist Isabel Webster, who is in Surrey. Isabel and Freddy, great to have you on the show with me this evening. Freddy, I want to start with you because we've heard from Donald Trump right there, and all of the signs are pointing towards military action. Will this be enough for the Iranian government to make a deal, as President Donald Trump is pushing for?
Well, as ever with Donald Trump, his opponents in the international arena and his allies, to some extent, are trying to figure out to what extent this is bluster and bluff and to what extent the threat is real. I think if we go back to the beginning of the year, it's quite interesting to do so, because when the Venezuela strike happened on the 3rd of January, there was instantly a lot of a talk in Washington that this was a sort of preemptive move towards a strike on Iran. And Venezuela and Iran aren't naturally two countries that you think of in the same breath, but they have had quite close relations in the past. They're obviously both major energy oil powers. And I think a lot of the thinking was that Israel has a large influence over Donald Trump's foreign policy thinking, and Netanyahu had been to Florida over the New Year period. And one of the things they talked about was the situation in Iran, where these protests subsequently broke out. Another aspect of this is after the Venezuelan strike, there was all the Greenland drama, which completely dominated the news. But in fact, it was while this Greenland drama that was going on that this armada, this flotilla of American ships, was on its way to the Arabian Seas. So some people are now thinking, was the whole Greenland drama a kind of smokescreen for an actually more serious operation that the Trump administration has always been set on, or has been set on in recent weeks? Or is this, again, brinksmanship to the maximum, trying to establish maximum leverage over Iran in the hopes of bringing them to the table?
And it's quite interesting, Isabel. Today we have got a reaction from Iran, and the advisor to Iran's supreme leader says any military action from US will see Iran targeting US and Israel and those who support it. So almost linking that there, Freddie. So I don't know what you think at the moment, Isabel, but, you know, Donald Trump's pushing for this diplomatic deal to be made, but Iran said it's not been in touch with the US when it comes to requesting negotiations.
Yes, as so often with Donald Trump, recollections most definitely vary. He's been claiming that the Iranian regime have been making lots of calls and that they want to make a deal and that he's confident that this isn't about to be World War III. And meanwhile, we're hearing from the Iranian foreign minister who said, and I quote, "We have our finger on the trigger." And they've said tonight that will be considered the beginning of a war and will be targeting the heart of Tel Aviv and all supporters of the aggressor, which will be incredibly alarming to many people. But also, when you look at this armada, this beautiful armada as Trump's describing it, and there are a lot of very serious assets, which I presume Iran will be very, very concerned about. And so what we're in a bit of a sort of brinkmanship situation, aren't we, which we're becoming more and more familiar with. It's been a month of it. And what we certainly know is that Donald Trump wants to come out looking like the strong man, because, you could argue that he was made to back down on Greenland. Although obviously was given an off-ramp and an ability to look like he was always planning to have the outcome that he got. But I mean, that was not the case. And it's the same with this, will he get the outcome that he wants? What is it exactly that he is seeking here? And don't forget that just a few weeks ago, 8th, 9th of January, when the worst of the protests were being attacked by the regime within Iran, and there were these threats of the execution of those that were in custody. He said that if those executions went ahead, then they would feel the full weight of American might upon them. Now, those executions have been deferred, that nothing's happened, but he would look silly, I think, if he wasn't to follow through with some action in Iran. So we are at a bit of a crossroads, an incredibly serious one. And I think, we just have to see what happens next. There are obviously lots of people speculating about whether or not there could be some sort of plan this weekend happening, whether they are looking for regime change. It's not exactly the same as the Venezuelan picture, of course, because Maduro essentially was betrayed by those people around him and propped up. The regime's been propped up by his deputy, whereas at the moment, Iran Khomeini, the supreme leader who's been running Iran since the fall of the Shah in 1979, has still got the support of the IRG, still got the support of the elites, I suppose, in the country, even if he has lost the citizens and the protesters who've been clamping down on so brutally. And they are also there within Iran at a threshold point, because, as people lose their livelihoods, they don't have access to food, the currency is falling through the floor. You will see repression getting stronger, but also businesses coming out and saying, actually, look, the support will be gone. The regime is incredibly weak at the moment, but I'm not clear, to be honest, what the end game is for the United States.
And Freddie, what Isabel says is absolutely accurate. From what I'm hearing from analysts in the region, they're saying that the Iranian government still has the military support behind it. We haven't seen any protests from the big oil workers who do work in Iran. So people are questioning how weakened they are at the moment. I don't know what you made of what Isabel said, but I think the big questions now move to what is the end game in Iran? And I think this is where concern is coming in. Is there a B plan like there possibly was in Venezuela, or is it just a completely different situation?
Well, Donald Trump, as a man on the international stage, has always been nervous of regime change. And as president, he has not really pursued regime change wars. Yes, there was a sort of decapitation exercise in Venezuela, but as Isabel rightly pointed out, essentially Maduro's deputy, Delcy Rodriguez, took the reins, and it's just a change of leadership rather than a regime change. Is it possible for Trump to strike Iran without moving towards a regime change conflict? That's a very difficult question. And I think, as you're alluding to there, I think a lot of Gulf state allies of the US, or people that talk to America, are warning them this might not be the right move, because the one thing that is sure to prop up the regime, or certainly its narrative, is that this is a sort of CIA Israeli operation to undermine their authority. And if Trump strikes that, will totally validate that story and galvanize the conservative support for the government in Tehran. And that's why Trump is this. Why some people think it might be more brinksmanship than a serious threat, because he knows that if he takes this step, another step against Iran, and he can't necessarily say this is about nuclear striking the nuclear facilities, because by his own rhetoric, those facilities have been completely obliterated, even if everybody knows that they haven't. So he might find himself being pushed into a corner that he doesn't necessarily want to be in, and somewhere he hasn't been as a commander-in-chief before.
Yeah, and that's such an interesting point, because I thought to myself today when I saw this latest warning from Donald Trump to Iran, it seemed to really focus, Freddie and Isabel, on the Iranian nuclear capabilities, and Donald Trump saying they just can't have them. Where just a few weeks ago, as you did point out, Isabel, it was about him saying to the protesters, keep going to the streets, help is on the way. The rhetoric has changed in many senses. And like you say, I wonder how he can sell this to the American people, because we did bring up Greenland, we did bring up Venezuela. He hasn't really concentrated on those domestic issues at home, has he, Freddie?
No, and I mean, the casus belli was apparently going to be the protest, but we don't know what's going on with the protest at the moment. It all seems very, very dark. As we understand, they have calmed down in the last week or so, and nobody quite knows the extent of suppression of the protests. So yes, there's talk about executing protesters, and that might be given as a reason to intervene. But I'm not sure that narrative is quite going to be bought by anyone concerned. So there has to be another reason, or a further development in the protests to justify some kind of strike. Otherwise, it looks like exactly what the Iranian regime, the government in Tehran, I should say, have always said it is.
Isabel, just a final thought for you on that. What do you think now when it comes to the protests in Iran? And like you did say, Freddie, it's very difficult to know exact numbers and stats coming out. We've heard lots of different numbers of people who have lost their lives. And I guess just a final thought for the people in Iran, what people are thinking right now going forward. As Donald Trump did say to them, help was on the way.
Yeah, I mean, our thoughts go out to those brave protesters out on the streets who, people who talk about the pre-1979 Iran, talk about a place with a high level of women and tertiary education and equal rights. And we've seen the economy tank within the country. They're tired of it and they want a regime change. But I want to come back to the point just before we move on about, what is the motivating factor here? What is the sort of thread of logic that we try to find in what Trump's doing? And he said repeatedly that America doesn't want to be the policeman of the world anymore. This is behind much of his argument around NATO. He doesn't want to go in and get involved in arbitration with every dictator or every regime that he doesn't agree with. Otherwise, goodness me, why has he got a problem with Iran and not with Putin? There is always a question, and there were also the suggestions around Greenland. What was his motivation there? Was it about access to minerals? So I'm never clear what the thread is behind his foreign policy. What I am certain of is that he wasn't elected for a second term to be embarking on multiple fronts overseas. And it is becoming increasingly unpopular with his base. And that will be in the back of his mind as the midterms are fast approaching.
Yeah, absolutely. Freddie and Isabel, thank you so much for your thoughts on that. Let's move on to another story now. And the situation in Minnesota is going to de-escalate a little bit. That's according to the president, Donald Trump, following the second fatal shooting of a U.S. citizen by ICE agents. Speaking to Fox News, Trump spoke about the deaths of Alex Pretty and Rene Good, who were both shot by federal immigration officers in Minneapolis. Trump said Pretty shouldn't have been carrying a gun, but didn't agree with members of his administration who called him a domestic terrorist. Take a listen.
We're going to de-escalate a little bit, but I will tell you, you look at the numbers, they're doing better than they've done in many years. I don't like the fact that he was carrying a gun that was fully loaded and he had 2 magazines with him, and it's pretty unusual. But nobody knows when they saw the gun, how they saw the gun, everything else. Bottom line, it was terrible. Both of them were terrible. The other was terrible, too. And I'm not sure about his parents, but I know her parents were big Trump fans. Makes me feel bad anyway. But, I mean, I guess you could say even worse. Bovino is very good, but he's a pretty out there kind of a guy, and in some cases that's good. Maybe it wasn't good here. But you have to understand, when I watch some of the people that I've been watching over the last few weeks, these are paid insurrectionists. These are paid agitators. These people aren't normal, like, oh, gee, that, you know, they're incensed about anything.
So, Isabel, we just heard there from President Donald Trump. Do you think that he's actually helping to de-escalate tensions the best he can, I guess?
It's funny, isn't it? This is somebody who was so desperate for a Nobel Peace Prize, and that is his best attempt at de-escalating, you know, questioning the reputation of people who are US citizens and, you know, causing no harm to anybody, losing their lives and killed in front of the eyes of the world. You know, yes, I think he's de-escalated in the sense he was referring to Bovino there. He's the commander at large of the Border Patrol, and he's pulled him out. He's sidelined Kirsty Noem from Homeland Security. He's reduced the number of Border Force ICE operatives in the city. But at the same time, you know, he's appearing to question the Second Amendment right in the American Constitution for Americans to bear arms. You know, he was perfectly within his rights, Alex Pretty, to be walking around bearing arms. And the NRA, the incredibly powerful lobby in the United States, have come out and are at odds with President Trump about this. And this has inflamed them and a huge number of his Republican base. Of course, lobbying is huge in the States, and the money involved from the NRA is important. As again, we're talking about midterms, he'll be having to be mindful of that. But he also made fairly incendiary comments today. We've seen the senator, I forget if she's a congresswoman, the Minnesota congresswoman, Ilhan Omar, today being attacked. And she was attacked with an unknown substance. There are investigations underway as to what it was. People at the scene said that it had a foul smell, and somebody was arrested. They came at her and you know, obviously wanting to spray her with a substance, which is incredibly alarming. And President Trump has come out. I mean, he's got beef with her anyway, but he's come out and said, well, she probably sprayed herself. Now, that is just adding, you know, fuel onto the fire and really unhelpful language. If you spoke to anybody in diplomacy, you know, if you want to de-escalate, these are not the things to do. So he's gone some way in terms of dialing things down, but I think he could have gone a lot further, to be perfectly honest.
And it's so interesting because we talk about Ilhan Omar there, don't we, Freddie, and what happened to her and what Donald Trump came out and said, as Isabel said, she just might have orchestrated this all herself. Once again, we know they don't get on at all, and that's quite important to point out. I want to just ask your thoughts on that. And also, when we talk about the protesters, I spoke to a really interesting reporter who's been on the streets of Minneapolis ever since these protests did break out. And he did say to me the protests are also ramping up against the ICE agents. So things between both sides have really hit crisis point.
Yes, I think on Ilhan Omar, I mean, there's deep hatred between Trump and her, and I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. I think on the protests generally, yes, it is absolutely appalling that these two people were killed in this way. There was no need for it to happen. But there is undeniably a concerted attempt to stop ICE by a large number of people in Minneapolis. And if it wasn't so cold there at the moment, things would be a lot worse because the protests would be far more vigorous. And the difficulty that a lot of the people who want to support the protesters are having is that actually, you know, on things like crime, Trump's policies on crime are divisive. They poll quite well on crime, actually. And if you look at the actual results of what's happened in cities that he has, in some ways, militarized the last few months, homicides are going down, carjackings are going down, robberies are going down. These facts are things that he will want to campaign on in the midterms. The problem he realized this week is that the optics of what's going on in Minneapolis are bad. And that is something that he has moved to address this week. And I think it's, you know, one of the rules of Trump 2.0 is never bend, never break. So never, give in the face of criticism or hostility in the media. But I think here has been a rare example where we have seen a bit of bending, because we've seen Trump say, actually, this is not going right. This is not the way we should be carrying out deportations. ICE is getting itself in a lot of trouble, and we want to change our tactics.
Isabel, I heard you want to interject there, give your thoughts, but Freddie, yeah, he does apparently seem to be softening his stance a little bit, and we wonder, Isabel, is it midterms, is it the polling, is it both sides of the political aisle are now saying, wow, what's happening with ICE is just not looking good?
Yeah, I mean, for people who are fans of Donald Trump will often say he's got a great nose for the public mood, but I think he was really slow on this. And, he might be in this never bend or break mold, and he's sort of breaking his own rule on this one, but he did it very slowly. I mean, I think the public mood was shocked after Renee Good was killed. In what world is it radical to block the path of officers? I mean, that's pretty much how the civil rights movement was carried out in the United States. That's how the suffragettes and women got their vote in this country. And there's nothing radical about trying to object peacefully to something that you think is morally repugnant. And, we've seen children being taken away from school, and many questionable tactics being used by ICE recently. And that's been reflected in the polls, YouGov. In April last year, there was a majority of people who actually 44% of voters liked what they were doing. 30% didn't. Well, January this year, before either of those American citizens were killed by ICE agents, 50% didn't like them, 32% did. And that has significantly changed since the killings. And around 63% of Americans believe that the killings were not justified. So he will be incredibly mindful of those midterms. His name isn't going to be on any of the tickets, but even his own Republicans are concerned that they could lose control of both houses. At one point, it was unheard of that anyone would be even contemplating that both houses could be lost. But that is a possibility, and I would say probably a large part of that is to do with how things have played out this January alone.
Yeah, absolutely. And just before we came to air in the last hour or so, there has been news that the federal agents involved in the fatal shooting of Alex Pretty in Minneapolis have been placed on leave. So that is happening now as we look at the story. But thanks so much for your thoughts there. We're going to move on now. And Syria's President Ahmed al-Sharaa is in Moscow today to meet with Russian President Vladimir Putin. It's thought the two leaders will discuss bilateral ties as well as ongoing conflicts in the Middle East. It follows a ceasefire agreement between the Syrian army and the Kurdish-led SDF after recent fighting in northeast Syria. Freddie, let's start with you. So what are they expected really to speak about at this meeting? Because we must remember that al-Sharaa was actually in Russia not that long ago, in October. It's almost 3 months on. So what's the new vibes?
Well, it's fascinating, isn't it? And I think it suggests that there's a much greater diplomatic game afoot than perhaps we are seeing at the sort of surface level. I mean, al-Sharaa was presented to the world as a kind of defeat for Putin because he'd lost his ally in Assad. Syria was effectively not his territory, not his area of influence anymore under al-Sharaa. But clearly there are other conversations going on. Al-Sharaa has been talking to Washington. He's met Donald Trump. There is clearly communications going on between Russia and Washington, not just about Ukraine, but about what's going on in the rest of the world and what's going on in the Middle East. And I strongly suspect that there is some sort of agreement, a tacit agreement maybe, an unspoken agreement maybe, between Washington and the Kremlin about Russia's role in Syria, because it's clearly not going to give up its influence there just because there's been a change of leader.
And it's so interesting because I was speaking to a professor a little bit earlier who is Syrian American, spent a lot of time in Syria recently, and he was making that point to me that what is happening now is the US still wants Russia to have a presence in Syria, and a lot of that reason is because of Israel. And Israel is arguing, and it's fearful that if Russia pulls out, it will create create a vacuum in Syria, which will increase the presence of Turkey in the country. So there's a lot of things happening, shadow diplomacy behind the scenes, according to who I was speaking to earlier. But Isabel, what about the Syrian assets Russia currently has? Will this be up for discussion? But when al-Shara has met with Putin, he has demanded for these assets to come back. And also, of course, we know Bashar al-Assad is taking refuge inside of Moscow.
He is, and they will be wanting him back to put him on trial, or who knows what, if he does ever return to Syrian soil. But, you know, when it comes to meetings with Putin, who knows what comes up for discussion? I mean, we know that with Witkoff, they are only given the Kremlin's translators, so it's not even guaranteed that the American message is getting through as they would like it to be presented, and in reverse. So who knows whether or not the same translating scenario will be afforded to the Syrians as well. They want $2 billion worth of assets back that were seized by the Russians, and you know, they may well mention it. Whether that message will fall on deaf ears, I don't know. But you're absolutely right to point out that Israel will be pulling strings very much. Benjamin Netanyahu very much has the ear of President Donald Trump, and they will be concerned about Turkish expansionism and providing a counterweight to that. And Israel, for all that has happened in recent months, and with this tentative, and I say tentative because around 400 civilians have lost their lives in Gaza since the ceasefire was notionally agreed, they are still very aware that they are facing fewer and fewer allies, particularly in the region. And so they want to strengthen their position where they can. So I think it's really, really fascinating what is happening, who's got whose ear. And, you know, and so many levels across many, many continents at the moment, we are seeing huge changes in the way that the world's being run, who's pulling the strings. And, you know, it will be absolutely fascinating to see what happens over the next 12 months. And I think it's really, really hard to predict exactly how things are going to play out.
I must tell you something, Isabel. I couldn't predict the last 3 weeks, so I think we've got a long time to predict.
2026 has been crazy.
Yeah, it's been exhausting. But
yes.
Freddie, final thoughts on what we're just talking about when it comes to Syria and Russia. And it's just absolutely fascinating when we talk about the diplomacy, because obviously the US is involved. We know the US is also involved to try to bring an end to the war between Russia and Ukraine. There is a lot happening at the moment.
There's an awful lot happening on so many fronts. And of course, the first story we talked about, Iran, is very much relevant to what's going on in Syria. If there is to be some kind of civil war in Iran, does Iran become a kind of Syria 2.0 situation in terms of unrest, in terms of potentially a future kind of ISIS force emerging from there? All these things have to be considered. And I thought it was very interesting in the leaked text. Well, they weren't leaked, they were published by Donald Trump, from Mark Rutte, head of NATO, and from Emmanuel Macron. The first thing they said to Trump in an attempt to suck up to him was, you've just done something amazing on Syria, referring to the ceasefire. And I think the second thing they were talking about, or second thing Macron wanted to talk about, was we can do something amazing in Iran. So what's going on there? And how does Russia fit into that picture? Because, of course, the Europeans are very opposed to Putin because of the war in Ukraine. But the Trump administration are desperate to get the Europeans on board with some kind of agreement with Russia over Ukraine. So lots of things going on, and we are seeing sort of strange glimpses now of a new emerging world order. It's fascinating to watch, but often very confusing.
Yeah, very confusing. But thank you so much for your thoughts on that story. And let's move on to another one now. And the British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, began his 3-day visit to China today with a large delegation of business leaders. Experts expect the UK is looking to enhance its trade relationship with Beijing. So, Freddie, a lot of people are actually calling this a historic moment. This is the first visit in 8 years. And the big question right now is, how important is this for Keir Starmer and for the UK?
Well, Keir Starmer is already facing quite a lot of criticism from the Conservative Party here in London, from the Reform Party, the new insurgent force in British politics, about his closeness to Beijing. And there's always been this suspicion that Keir Starmer is a natural anti-Brexiteer. He's a natural Europhile. And Europe at the moment is very nervous of what Trump is doing on the world stage, as we've already alluded to. And there is a sort of mood in Europe that is actually reflected in Washington too, that there's a China-led future and there's an America-led future. And increasingly European powers are being pulled between the two. And Keir Starmer, because of Britain's historic closeness to America, has so far done quite a good job of juggling the two. But that, since the Greenland drama, that Trump sort of came out quite critical of the UK. And I think there's a sort of growing suspicion in Washington that actually Starmer is quite eager to curry favor with Beijing over Washington. And a lot of the rhetoric we heard about his trip to Beijing today was China's very concerned about Britain's closeness to America. And that's a very odd thing for China to be concerned about, because Britain has for a very long time been close to America. So it's another interesting shifting fans of diplomacy story. But Starmer's got to be pretty careful because, you know, Rachel Reeves, his chancellor, went to Beijing in the early days of his administration and announced a kind of 60 billion or something investment. And I suspect that's what's going to happen here. Is Starmer's going to come up with a big number. It's going to sound very impressive. And then we might not ever figure out where that money materializes, where it comes from, how it's developed. And there's a suspicion that Britain is selling out its prestige, its power on the world stage, just to get cash in from China.
And you know what I find so fascinating, actually, because he's also walking a tricky tightrope, Isabel, Keir Starmer, because remember, Mark Carney just went to China recently. Of course, he's the Canadian Prime Minister, and they talked about reaching these trade deals. And Donald Trump retaliated and said if that happens, he was going to put a 100% tariff on Canada. So Donald Trump is watching these meetings very closely. And I know Keir Starmer's keen to say that the UK and the US have this special relationship, but it is a tough challenge for Keir Starmer.
Yeah, it's really difficult, and it speaks to desperation, if you ask me. I mean, you know, this is a government that promised growth and has so far been unable to deliver it. And they know that if people feel worse off when it comes to the next election, it's very likely that Nigel Farage, whether he has proper policies or not, will benefit from that. And so he has to find that growth from somewhere. And he's very, very keen to get that bounce from China. But that can come with its own whole host of problems. As you mentioned, you can enrage your already unreliable and unpredictable ally, America. You also have all the issues around spying, and there have been a historic number of incidents when you've seen Chinese spies infiltrating Parliament. You had GCHQ come out and declare that it was highly likely that the Chinese had interfered in the Electoral Commission in 2021, 2022. All the issues around Huawei, and now we're seeing, you know, them being phased out in this country as well. It's not exactly what you would call a trusting relationship. And we've been hearing on the airwaves that China hawk today, Ian Duncan Smith, really sounding the alarm bells. We've also got the super embassy that's just been approved here, and people describe it as those who are concerned about it, you know, that they might see refugees, Hong Kong, people who fled Hong Kong being kidnapped and saying they no longer feel safe on the streets of London where we've been harbouring them. So it's an incredibly fraught situation, and I wouldn't want to be having to make those decisions, but I do think you have to be in the room and have those conversations. We are a weakened country post-Brexit, irrespective of whether you're a Brexiteer or not, a GDP 8% down year on year. And we have this unreliable special relationship now, the European Union, even as you pointed out, having these conversations with Beijing. So you have to go, you have to explore opportunities. I also had a really interesting interview this morning on the radio. I don't know if you heard it, Freddie, here in the UK. One of the delegation is a representative from Brompton. These are these foldable bikes. My husband sweetly disappears off on every day and then folds up onto a train and then takes it into town. They have a huge number of sales over in China. And the representative from Brompton on the radio this morning was saying, look, global warming, climate change is not a Chinese problem, it's not a British problem, it's a global problem. We're only going to solve it if we work together. Now, if we're selling bicycles to a place that is a hugely polluting country, we are helping the global picture. So it's all about, Starmer's, I think Freddie's right, it does speak to Starmer's natural position, which is to be outward looking rather than the sort of nationalistic, isolationist position that we are seeing increasingly from his opponents here. So interesting times. I wouldn't 100% trust China as a trading partner, but I think we have to be at the table and have those conversations.
Freddie, thoughts from you?
Well, I think Isabel speaks very clearly and well about it, as ever. But I think a really fascinating part of this to me is, of course, COVID, which is probably the biggest calamity to have affected Western economies in my lifetime, even bigger than the financial crash in many ways. And the very fact that China has not been transparent about the origins of COVID, and no national state, even Donald Trump doesn't talk about this. Nobody, because China is so powerful economically that nobody is willing to demand that China is more transparent about what happened with COVID. And if there was any other country in the world, the pressure to find out the roots of the virus, the origins of the virus would be overwhelming. But yet, Keir Starmer will go to Beijing and it will not be mentioned because it cannot be mentioned. And I think that's a staggering aspect of this story.
I never ever thought of that, actually.
Yeah, I just wanted to add in that final point is that, you can get a lot of cheap goods from China, but we know that there are human costs to all of this. Why is it so cheap? Because of their, willingness to use slave labor. And there are people who want Starmer to raise the issues of human rights while he's there, and also about some of the prisoners in Hong Kong who are facing horrendous situations just for trying to maintain the freedoms that they'd enjoyed in a country that, has had a very heavy-handed authoritarian imposition imposed on them.
I do think it's one thing to outline, because I was listening a little bit to just some stats between the UK and China, and Keir Starmer has said this trip really boils down to a lot about the economy. It's all about a strategic reset. And we must remember, China's second largest economy in the world. It's the UK's third biggest trading partner. It supports over 300,000 jobs in the UK. So, we have the arguments for and against, and we've got the statistics. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens on his charm offensive for 5 days in Beijing. So thank you so much for your thoughts on that. Now, it's that time of the show where Isabel and Freddie, they've chosen two of their quirkiest stories of the day. Freddie, let's start with you. And it's about the doomsday clock. It's moved closer to midnight. How worried should everybody be?
Well, I think as a fairly gloomy person, I think we should always be worried about doomsday. But I was made aware of this story. Again, it's been bubbling for a while. The doomsday clock is a sort of story that comes up every now and then. We say, how close are we to midnight on the doomsday clock, which is supposedly about nuclear annihilation. And my son just heard about it through some sort of social media feed. And he was like, oh, yeah, apparently we're closer than ever to doomsday, which means the world's going to end. And he was very much convinced that this was true and that the world is about to end. I think we should add a bit of skepticism about doomsday clock. It often has been quite hysterically presented. I think there is undoubtedly factors that suggest that the kind of peaceful world order that we've had since the Second World War is, as with all the stories we've been discussing tonight, big things are happening, the world is changing and so on. But I also think this sort of online tendency, and the doomsday clock does not help this, to think that apocalypse is nigh. We've all become, it's almost like we've all become members of a strange cult that thinks that we are bound to be incinerated at any given moment. And so I think we should just add a little bit of skepticism to it. And I realise the Anne Finley story is meant to be jolly and fun. And so I'm sorry that my story is about the end of the world. But I think it's an interesting story.
But it is quirky. Let's not think too much about it. It can be quirky and fun. But I just remember that I saw the story, and I think it was about 25 years ago or so, the doomsday clock was a big thing because of what the world was going through right then. When we had the war in Iraq, things were very different. Nuclear weapons were being talked about all the time. And now we're back in the same position, but I felt like the doomsday clock is back. It's interesting after so many years, but that's just...
The doomsday clock is on a time loop.
It's on a time loop. There we are. And Isabel, yours is something a little bit different. It's about a K-pop and a presidential... have I got this all right? A presidential request.
Yes, you have. So I don't know by the sounds of it if you're a K-pop fan or not, Leigh-Ann, or if you are, Freddie, but I came late to the party to this through K-pop Demon Hunters. My now 8-year-old daughter is absolutely obsessed, and I've been converted to really fully appreciate this genre, which is a kind of mixture of hip-hop, pop music and R&B, and they rehearse with an inch of their lives. Their beats are just incredible, and they are increasingly popular around the world. So anyway, this band, a huge boy band, not only just in terms of numbers, there's 7 of them, I think, BTS, known as the Bangtan Boys, but also hugely popular around the world, have reformed after 4 years off and are about to go off on their world tour. But one of their biggest markets, I think the third biggest market for K-pop music is actually in Mexico, and the president of Mexico is so upset that the boys are only stopping in Mexico City for 3 nights on their 79 date world tour that she has written to the president of South Korea to personally request more dates in the country. And apparently it's been absolutely crazy. There have been issues with dynamic pricing. Some people have been paying tickets north of £750 each, but I think only 150,000 tickets were available, and I think it was some crazy number, like 1 million youngsters trying to get their hands on them. So it sounds like K-pop need to, this band BTS need to get back to Mexico and capitalize on it all. But I have to say I am a bit of a fan, and it started in the 90s. It's only taken me till now to appreciate it, but it's on the rise. So if you haven't heard K-pop Demon Hunters, guys, you will. We'll get you eventually.
Can I tell you something? K-pop wasn't something that was really on my radar either. My boyfriend introduced it to me because he really likes all this sort of stuff, anime and K-pop. And I love that song. Is it We're Going Up, Up, Up? That's K-pop Demon Hunters. It's brilliant. Freddie, you must have heard it. It's the best song.
I'm afraid I've actually banned it from our car because it was being played far too often, and it drives me mad. I can't bear it, I'm afraid. I'm not a K-pop fan.
It's awful, but the beat is so good, Freddie.
It's so good.
So on point.
It's like algorithmically generated horror. That's what it sounds like to me. Yeah.
Well, Freddie, you sound like
the algorithmically generated horrors we've discussed tonight. That's the least offensive.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, it's interesting you're pointing out the diplomacy. The real shadow diplomacy is about K-pop.
Yeah, exactly.
You sound like the doomsday dad, I must say, Freddie. Banning the K-pop tunes.
I'm sorry.
Well, I remember when the cult of Taylor Swift arrived in the UK, and you were equally gloomy about your daughter going to see that, and you did think it was a cult, didn't you?
I did. I'm very suspicious about these things, but she went to the concert and she's still sort of delightful. So yes, yeah.
Good. I'm one of these people who's definitely a cult member, sort of believe in the doomsday clock. I'm a Swiftie and I like K-pop. So anyway, hopefully me and your daughter have a few things in common. But thank you so much to our guests, Freddy Gray, Deputy Editor of The Spectator, and broadcaster and journalist Isabel Webster. And that's all from us from W News Extra. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on X. G&T will be coming up next. Goodbye, and thank you for joining us.